Ladies and gentlemen, permit me, if you will, to step away from the ordinary and peer into a shadowed corner of the world, not with the eyes of superstition, but with the lens of spiritual discernment. When I speak of witches, I do not refer merely to broomsticks and cauldrons, nor to the misunderstood practitioners of earthy rites. I speak of witches as archetypes of manipulative, corrupting forces, those who seduce, ensnare, and enchant not with magic alone, but with charm, cunning, and chaos. And just as a flame draws the moth, so do certain kinds of souls draw these dark forces like iron to the lodestone. Let us examine these 6 types, not to condemn, but to awaken, for recognizing the shape of one's own shadow as the first act of stepping into light. There exists a subtle but dangerous condition in the human soul, a kind of hollowing out, a spiritual vacancy that leaves a person open to all manner of influence. This emptiness is not always visible. The spiritually hollow often appear curious, kind, and searching, but beneath the surface lies a void, a craving for meaning so profound that it begins to outpace the person's ability to judge what is good, what is true, or what is dangerous. They hunger, but they do not taste carefully, and so they become easy prey for those who would manipulate them under the guise of wisdom, power, or belonging. This craving is not inherently wrong. The human spirit was made to long for transcendence, to ask questions that cannot be answered with simple facts or formulas. But when a person severs themselves from rooted beliefs, when they reject not only tradition but also the work of building personal conviction, they often mistake openness for enlightenment. They become like abandoned temples, beautiful on the outside but echoing within. And into that echo chamber step the witches of our time, those who promise meaning but deliver only enchantment, who use language not to reveal truth but to distort it. The spiritually empty are easy to lead because they are tired of wandering. They latch on to the first thing that offers warmth, even if that warmth is artificial. A manipulator doesn't need to shout. They only need to whisper what the hollow soul already wants to hear. You are special. You have been kept from your destiny. Others cannot see what you see. And so, flattered and enthralled, the empty person follows, believing they found depth when in truth they've only encountered another mask. Discernment, the ability to separate gold from glitter, is not something that arrives by accident. It is born of struggle, discipline, and humility. The spiritually empty often lack these not because they are foolish, but because they've been told to skip the hard questions and trust their feelings instead. And feelings, for all their color, make poor guides through the fog of life. Manipulators understand this instinctively. They tailor their spells to stir emotion rather than provoke thought. They bypass the mind and go straight to the ache. What's most tragic is that the spiritually empty often sense the danger, but ignore it. They feel the chill beneath the charm, but tell themselves it is just the cost of belonging. They sense that something is being traded, but they convince themselves it is only their past, not their freedom. And slowly, the enchantment deepens. They don't even notice that their choices are no longer their own, that their thoughts are being shaped for them, that their soul is being slowly occupied. Manipulators do not need to take the strong by force. They need only find the hollow and fill them with illusion. For the one who does not know who they are, any voice that speaks loudly enough can become the truth. There is a peculiar blindness that often afflicts those who place supreme confidence in their own intellect. It is not the ignorance of the uninformed, nor the naivete of the innocent. It is a more refined and deceptive form of blindness, the kind that disguises itself as vision. When a person comes to believe that their intelligence makes them immune to deception, they unknowingly make themselves more susceptible to it. For while the mind may be sharp, it is still human, and the very pride in its sharpness becomes in the armor. Those who pride themselves on intellect often cultivate a quiet contempt for simpler minds. They see the superstitions of the common crowd, the emotional pleas of the vulnerable, the traditions of the faithful, and imagine themselves above it all. They do not need guidance, they believe, for they are the guides. They do not fear the dark paths, for they trust their own ability to navigate any maze. But what they fail to see is that the very confidence they place in their minds creates a blind spot an area where humility and caution should dwell, now replaced by arrogance and self-assurance. Witches, those who twist truth for their own ends, who manipulate through charm or intellect, rarely waste time on the foolish. They much prefer the clever. The clever are better tools, better allies, and more satisfying conquests. And best of all, they resist less because they do not believe they can be fooled. Flattery, the oldest enchantment in the world, works wonders on the intellectual. Tell them they are different. Tell them they see what others do not. Appeal to their sense of isolation, their feeling of being surrounded by lesser minds. Before long, they are listening not because they agree, but because they want it to be true. The trouble with intellect is that it can rationalize anything. A brilliant person can build a cage out of logic and call it freedom. They can make compromises and tell themselves they are being pragmatic. They can sense the manipulation and convince themselves they are in control. They can even begin to play along with the deceiver, thinking it is they who are using the other, but slowly, subtly, they find that their steps are being guided, their thoughts shaped, their independence eroded. It is not the mind that leads the fall, but the pride that rides upon it. Corrupt influence rarely approaches in the form of outright evil. It appears instead as opportunity, validation, or advantage. It speaks to the wound. It says, you were right to be angry. It says, the world owes you more. It says, you don't need to wait for anyone's permission anymore. And to the traumatized, ambitious soul, these words sound like freedom. They are not seen as temptations, but as justice. The manipulator, the corrupt guide, simply provides the mask, whether it is power, wealth, recognition, or superiority. The wounded person wears it gratefully, not realizing it will become a prison. This is why many of the world's most dangerous tyrants, deceivers, and cult leaders began as victims. They suffered real pain, but instead of healing, they built empires from their brokenness. And in doing so, they became mirrors of the very forces that wounded them. Their ambition, which might have been a source of good, becomes a weapon for themselves and for others. And all along, they believe they are simply taking what they deserve, rising above the smallness of their past. But in reality, they are being used, shaped by darker forces that know how to exploit the unhealed heart. Witches, in the broadest symbolic sense, are drawn to such souls not out of pity, but opportunity. They see the crack in the armor. They understand that ambition fueled by hurt will never say enough. It will always want more affirmation, more control, more escape, and it will do whatever is required to get it. The witch does not need to deceive someone fully whole. She only needs to speak to the parts still aching and assure them that power will make the pain go away. And for the ambitious wounded, that promise is often enough.
Idealists move through the world with open hearts and bright eyes, believing in the inherent goodness of others and in the possibility of redemption for all. They are the dreamers, the ones who see potential where others see danger, who believe that love can heal, that kindness can transform, and that darkness is just misunderstood light. But such beautiful beliefs, untempered by discernment, can become a liability. Idealists often fall not because they are weak, but because they are so convinced of the good that they become unable or unwilling to see the shadow hiding beneath the smile. There is a particular kind of deception that dresses itself not in threats, but in elegance. It is charm, polished and graceful, clever and magnetic. It speaks softly, listens well, and wears the face of empathy. To the idealist, this charm feels like affirmation. They are drawn to it instinctively, believing they found a kindred spirit or a kind soul. They confuse beauty with virtue, eloquence with wisdom, and charisma with character, and by the time they sense something is amiss, the spell is often already working. The deceiver knows this pattern well. Witches, whether literal, metaphorical, or psychological, do not need brute force to ensnare an idealist. They need only to mirror their dreams. If the idealist longs for love, they offer devotion. If they yearn for justice, they echo their outrage. If they crave meaning, they supply a narrative filled with depth and destiny. But it is all performance, carefully tailored to keep the idealist engaged and emotionally invested. The beauty the idealist sees is not real, only reflected, crafted to keep them enchanted. The problem is not that idealists trust. It is that they often trust too quickly and too deeply. They extend compassion even when it is not earned. They assume that if someone seems broken or misunderstood, they must be good at heart. And while this impulse is admirable, it is also dangerous. For not everyone who is broken wants to be whole. Not everyone who has suffered seeks healing. Some use their scars as bait, weaving them into stories that appeal to the idealist's desire to help, to rescue, to redeem. In this way, the idealist becomes not a light in the dark, but fuel for someone else's fire. Beauty has always had the power to captivate, but in the hands of the manipulator it becomes a weapon. The idealist, entranced by what they hope is true, stops asking hard questions. They silence their doubts to protect the story they've begun to believe. They may even defend the one who harms them, convinced that they simply need more love, more understanding, more time. But this loyalty is not noble, it is exploited. And every time the idealist forgives what should not be ignored, the deceiver digs deeper in. It is a cruel irony that those who believe most in the good are often the last to see when it is absent. They do not lack intelligence. They lack suspicion. And in a world where some wear beauty as a disguise, that lack can be costly. There are those who appear compliant on the surface, respectful, measured, agreeable, but beneath that exterior a quiet rebellion simmers. These are the secret rebels, not the loud dissenters or the ones who wear their defiance on their sleeves. They are harder to see, harder to predict, and far more susceptible to influence because their rebellion is hidden not only from others, but often from themselves. They move through life with a deep resistance to authority, structure, and restraint, yet they mask it with politeness and apparent conformity. To the outside world, they are model citizens, but inwardly, they are constantly testing limits, wondering what lies just beyond the border of what's allowed. Secret rebels are drawn to the forbidden not out of curiosity alone, but because they crave the feeling of autonomy. Rules feel like cages, and even when those rules serve a higher purpose, the rebel chafes against them. They may not speak their discontent, but it shows in small acts of private disobedience, in thoughts they never voice, in attractions they cannot justify. When something is declared off limits, it becomes magnetic. Not because they believe it's good or true, but because it represents escape. And in the allure of that escape, they become vulnerable to voices that speak in whispers rather than commands. Witches, in the symbolic sense, know how to find the secret rebel. They do not scold or correct, they affirm. They do not warn about consequences. They promise liberation. You've always felt different, they say. They just want to control you. But I see what you're really capable of. These words are not thrown at the rebel. They are drawn out from within. The seduction lies in giving voice to what the rebel already feels, but has never dared to say aloud. It's not a sudden leap into darkness. It's a series of small permissions that feel like freedom. The danger for the secret rebel is not that they are evil. It's that they refuse to recognize how far they've already drifted. Each forbidden idea they entertain feels like an act of independence, a harmless thought experiment, a justified exception. But in reality, they are being led, slowly, subtly, away from what anchors them. By the time they realize they've crossed a line, that line is far behind them, blurred and indistinct. And the new terrain feels thrilling, even empowering, but it is unstable, built on illusions that will one day collapse. Rebellion in itself is not always wrong. There are times when it is necessary, even noble. But secret rebellion that resists accountability and disguises itself as innocence is far easier to corrupt. It creates a soul that believes it is in control while surrendering inch by inch to manipulation. The seduction lies in the belief that crossing a line is an act of self-discovery, not of surrender. But no one who is being used ever sees it that way in the beginning. They only see a door that others told them not to open, and they cannot resist turning the handle. Loneliness is more than just the absence of company. It is a silent ache that dulls the soul and clouds judgment. It strips away the edges of discernment, making a person less concerned with what is true and more concerned with what is near. The lonely are not always visibly isolated. They may live among crowds, speak to many, even laugh in the right moments. But beneath the surface there is a hunger, a deep and persistent yearning to be seen, to be understood, to be chosen. This yearning, left unmet, becomes a vulnerability, and there are those who know exactly how to exploit it. People who feel profoundly alone are often the quickest to respond to the promise of connection, no matter how superficial or dangerous. The manipulator, the witch, the deceiver, they do not need to offer truth or even kindness. They only need to offer attention. A glance, a kind word, a shared secret. These simple gestures become lifelines to the one who has been wandering without anchor. Suddenly they feel found, and in that feeling, their defenses lower. The desire to belong overtakes the desire to be safe. The lonely rarely ask, "Is this good for me?" Instead, they ask, "Will this accept me?" And because of that shift, they are easily drawn into relationships, ideologies, and roles that may harm them. What matters most in their eyes is not whether something is healthy, but whether it fills the silence. The deceiver understands this and crafts their invitation accordingly. They do not lead with logic or demands. They lead with warmth, with phrases like, "You're one of us," "You're not like the others," or "I've been waiting for someone like you." These are not lies in the technical sense. They are enchantments, woven to mimic intimacy. Once the lonely person accepts the bait, they are unlikely to question what follows. They have already anchored themselves emotionally. To step away would mean risking solitude again, and solitude has become unbearable. So they can play, they adjust, they justify, and each small compromise feels less like surrender and more like gratitude. The manipulator's demands are often framed as signs of trust. If you really cared, if you want to belong, if you don't want to be alone again. These phrases strike deep, not because they are logical, but because they threaten the very thing the lonely person thought they had finally found: acceptance. Perhaps the most tragic part of this dynamic is that the lonely person is not naive. They often sense something is wrong. But in their mind, a harmful relationship still feels better than no relationship. They confuse pain with connection, control with closeness. And by the time the harm becomes obvious, they have lost not only their freedom, but the very self they once hoped to share with someone else. To the lonely, even false belonging feels like salvation, and that makes them the perfect prey, not because they are weak, but because their need is strong enough to silence their suspicion.